The year is 2017. The Wimbledon Championships men's finale, which is not lost on anyone here. Jodie Whittaker is announced as the 13th Doctor. What followed next is possibly one of the most divisive eras of Doctor Who, certainly of the new era. We saw the first female Doctor. We saw changes made to canon. We saw 3 seasons of honestly creative, ambitious, lacking stories. But more importantly, we saw a fandom really start to tear itself apart from the inside. But we're not here to talk about that. Actually, we are here to talk about that. And you may be hearing a bit of a laughter in the background. That's because there's something special about this review, this particular episode. If you have been here since the beginning and are still here, first of all, you are troopers and you are choosing not to be at a better YouTube channel. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. But if you have been here, you may remember the first video we did was the 13th Doctor announcement of Jodie Whittaker. And I made that video. I stand by everything I made on that video. Everything I said, I stand by to this day. Someone did find me. Someone did reach out to me. Someone wanted to talk. And that's really what the Bucket Think Tank is about. Talking to people that I want to talk to. For this 13th Doctor retrospective, I have brought a friend, someone who has much more knowledge of Doctor Who than I do. I say that with full confidence. He's produced he's produced a couple of Doctor Who projects of his own. He's possibly a massive, the biggest living Pertwee fan. And possibly one of the few people I can say enjoyed most, if not all, of Colin Baker's era on television. Coat and all. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is my friend, the head of Black Glove Studios, Chris McKeon.
Oh, thank you.
So, how you doing, Chris? How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a nice evening here, and probably not quite as late as where you are, but things are great here, and I'm honestly happy to be here and kind of reach its full circle point as we do a what may be a retrospective, possibly a post-mortem of a long corpse of the Jodie Whittaker era.
Yes. Jodie Whittaker's era, I think, is one that people like to compare her to the 7th Doctor's era, which I think was more people outwardly saying this was going to be the end of Doctor Who, or the fact that maybe there was 1 or 2 elements of her that reminded them of the 7th Doctor. And of course, going into what we'll talk about later in the 2nd season of her era, feel like a completion of the Cardinal Master Plan, which was a big part of the 7th Doctor's era. Some have compared it to the 6th Doctor. This is, I think, primarily because Colin Baker really came out in defense of her a bit more than I felt was necessary, but maybe it was necessary on some level. I felt she was a bit bland like the 5th Doctor in some ways, especially with the costume. But more than anything, because we can talk about the production and its ups and downs, but I think what the 13th Doctor's era was more telling about the fandom and where everything was at that point, because it was very hard to have an honest conversation about any of her episodes without being called you were an SJW or you were some sort of bigot. If you did, you couldn't just say this was an episode of Doctor Who and it did A and B right, but it could have done C better. It either had to be perfect or absolute trash. And I'd sort of like your opinion on that one.
I think you're absolutely right. I won't lie or pretend that I can be, I suppose, on certain things, perhaps especially on issues or ideas or topics where I don't know much. But when it comes to Doctor Who, I know a lot, and so I have definite opinions about the program. And I said this before as a preamble to what I was about to say about my opinions, where I stand on opinions of Jodie Whittaker, is that prior to Jodie Whittaker, if someone asked me, "Do you have who is your favorite Doctor? You have a favorite Doctor?" I would always say, no, I don't. I love them all equally. And that is absolutely true. What you said about Pertwee and Colin Baker and how I feel about it is true, and also is equally true for all the other 10 mainline Doctors prior to Jodie Whittaker. But when Jodie Whittaker came, I amended my answer, and I said this before to others, which is that I still don't have a favorite Doctor, but I have a least favorite Doctor now. And Jodie Whittaker is sadly the least favorite. It remains to be seen what comes afterwards, because I know there's still Doctor Who afterwards, after Jodie Whittaker, but she is my least favorite, and therefore that's the preamble for saying that I am not ambivalent or without an opinion. No, I definitely fall more towards the side that a lot of Jodie Whittaker's era I feel was subpar at best and abysmal at worst. But you're absolutely right, and at the same time, you're absolutely right that it almost seemed like at the time, it really probably was the case, that it seemed to be within online discussions by the very late teens, in the very early 20s, that you had to be an acolyte follower or Jodie Whittaker, or an absolute opponent or a nemesis to Jodie Whittaker. You had to love her or you had to hate her. And that meant if you loved her episodes, that meant you had to love everything. You had to love her costume, you had to love her hair, you had to love every line of dialogue, you had to love every joke, you had to love every set piece, every scene, every direction, every large font caption on the screen saying this is Hong Kong, or this is California, or this is Brazil. No, if you hated it, all those other things, but you had to really hate it. It means you had to say there's nothing that she can do right. She's a terrible actress. But then it could get very personal. She herself is stupid, or she herself is dumb. Jodie Whittaker is ugly. Jodie Whittaker isn't even a woman. Or the 13th Doctor is a fool. The 13th Doctor is callous, or she's unkind. She's stupid. So there was no middle ground for a lot of people. You had to love it or you had to hate it. Now, I'm not, like I say, I'm not going to pretend to say I was right down the middle. No, I tended to really dislike the episodes. But if someone liked the episodes, I really didn't want to engage in the whole idea of becoming an opposition or an enemy of that person. It's not personal. This is a television show that can inspire us. If it inspires you, it can inspire you to like it or not like it, but if it inspires you, understand why it inspires other people and accept it and try to find that common ground. And sometimes you could just simply say, well, it brought, like you and I met because of Jodie Whittaker, so there is a silver lining there, of course. But at the least, it really exposed the Jodie Whittaker era, whether intentional or not, whether there is a correlation to specifically Jodie's era or not. Her era, that time period, really exposed a lot of the cannibalistic, the self-harming and self-consuming elements of Doctor Who fandom, at least at that time, and perhaps even now too.
Yeah, and now the dust has sort of settled. Well, it's settled. Let's be honest. The dust has settled. She has begun to make a home for herself on Big Finish, and the fans are sort of willing to come back to the discussion of the 13th Doctor. And they were doing it well before we decided to do it now, because this has been in the works for a while, people. As you all know, I'm behind on a great many projects, but we are slowly getting up there. And I do plan on doing, if you recall, we did a tier list for the classic era Doctors. So I do want to do one for the new Who Doctors, which will end with Jodie Whittaker. I'm splitting those into 3 eras, basically. The new Who era, or the classic Who era, the new Who era, and I guess the short-lived Disney Who era, because it fundamentally does feel like a different program in some ways. And that's not to say it's a bad thing or a good thing. It just is.
Yes.
Also makes the tier list easier to do. Sometimes the easiest reason is the best reason to do anything. But what I wanted to do for this was sort of talk about each season and the new elements it brought in. And of course, one thing we have to bring up is the man, the myth, the legend. You don't really love him. Some people hate him. I'm indifferent to him at this point. Chris Chibnall.
Yes.
It could have been a lot better. It could have been slightly better written, especially the last story.
He was the showrunner for this. He's the Doctor Who fan.
Yes.
And I think some people say he doesn't like Doctor Who. I don't think that's true. I think Chibnall, at the end of the day, may have loved Doctor Who and just had more ambition and drive than he may have had the ability to bring to fruition, as well as things like COVID. I'm not going to act like he didn't have any setbacks. Was it a good idea to cast a female doctor? Taking what he said on face value, he's like, hey, it was going to be controversial one way or the other. It was going to happen at some point.
Yes.
My understanding was it came up during the Tom Baker era, whether or not apparently a female doctor would have possibly been the choice after Peter Davison. If you've watched the Moffat era, which I brought up in my video announcing it, he was sprinkling the seeds for that a long time ago, his era. Fans have debated, even still debate, whether or not the Doctor should or shouldn't be a woman. Narratively, in terms of does it make sense in the universe of Doctor Who, it does. It does. Should it have been? You're of two minds of that. You're either the Peter Davison standpoint, which is like, no, shouldn't, because of how important the Doctor as a character is to young boys. And you're the defense of Colin, who quoted himself, she's the Doctor whether you like it or not. I think it's kind of pointless to debate it because it already happened.
Yeah.
It already happened. I don't want mom and dad to get divorced. Well, I hate to tell you this, Timmy, they're already divorced. They're both splitting up the Beanie Babies and going over a schedule.
Yeah.
But it's important to talk about Chris Chibnall.
Yes.
And what his vision for Doctor Who is. What do you think about Chibnall as a showrunner? And you know more showrunners than I do. Not personally, unless you've been hiding out on me. But you can name them all better than I have over the course of Doctor Who. I kind of stop. I can go Moffat, Chibnall, of course, Moffat, RTD, J&T, and I think, was Philip Hinchcliffe a showrunner?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. And I can go Philip Hinchcliffe. These are names I know and can say with confidence. Other names I've never really said. So what is, as sort of like in his entirety, how would you sum up Chibnall as a showrunner? Because you can't separate the Whittaker era from Chris Chibnall.
No. And it's very difficult in certain ways, like Jodie Whittaker herself. And I suppose this might be, in a weird way, it can be a negative, but certainly can be a positive in that it engages the mind trying to figure out the characterization of Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, and therefore Chris Chibnall, who is the man behind it. He wrote, quite a few of her episodes, and he's the guiding light, so to speak, or the prime mover, or the guy that's shaping everything, forging her character. Very difficult to do. And I'll answer the question and start this by saying that we've discussed this before. An interesting conundrum about Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. Why is it sometimes hard to figure her out? And therefore, by extension, Chris Chibnall, for a different reason, which is that if you watch the episodes, when we sampling of the episodes, you'll have these YouTube videos that say Jodie Whittaker or the 13th Doctor being chaotic for 13 minutes. And you'll see clips of her Doctor being silly or quirky or scatterbrained or such. And then if you listen, so in that mind, you would think the 13th Doctor is a scatterbrained, quirky, bright, happy character. And that's true. But you would only have a small part of the picture, 13 minutes of her whole history. But if you listen to and watch and listen to contemporary interviews of both Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall talking about their Doctor, the 13th Doctor, and therefore their vision, the vision of the series. They will often discuss, and I say this because they both are really speaking from the same page, because you sometimes know of doctors and showrunners that are very much in sync, like John Pertwee and Barry Letts. Let's name another showrunner. Barry Letts was the producer of the John Pertwee era, or Philip Hinchcliffe and Tom Baker in his early years. They work very well, but then you sometimes have showrunners and producers and doctors who don't work well, like Tom Baker again, and maybe John Nathan Turner, who was his last producer. Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker seem to work very well together. They seem to be really close friends. So when they talk in these in print and video or audio interviews, contemporary at the time, they are in sync, saying the same thing, which is that Jodie's Doctor has two sides to her personality. She has a quirky side and a bright, happy side, and then a socially awkward side. So a quirky side and an innocent side. What they never discuss is that there's a third side to her character that you see quite often, and perhaps more so as time passes, but even as early as her second episode, probably her first, which she has a very cold, callous, aggressive side. For example, in Ascension of the Cybermen, when and I can't remember her name, but the Scottish woman who, when they meet those few humans who've survived at the end of the universe, and the Scottish lady starts explaining their history and how they survived the Cybermen, saying, yes, we survived this and we got out of this, and then Jodie Whittaker cuts her off very abruptly, says, I don't need your whole life history. There's that sharp side to her that suddenly kind of crashes through that dichotomy of the character. And because that, and it exists, it's not just an isolated incident. She does that a lot. She's quite sharp at times with Yaz. She's very kind of dismissive to Graham. It's not quite the same thing, but she's very sharp with the Enzo, I think is his name, the guy that had the cigar and the ghost money. He was saving it for a reason, right? Right from the start, she's very sharp and mean and snarly with him. It's almost people seem to forget that there's that snarly side to her character. So why do I say all this? It's overlooked, right? But there's that snarly side. I say that because it's hard to grasp, and we may talk about this in a moment, that really the character of the 13th Doctor, because there's this unspoken sides to her character. And it's not that, it's might be that some people don't want to talk about that, but it might also be because it's never discussed, even by the actress and the show creator. So that to a certain extent, Chris Chibnall is like that. Not in Starlings. He seems like a nice man, and he seems like an enthusiastic man about Doctor Who. But he's harder to grasp as a personality, as a media personality, because unlike his two predecessors, Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies, he's not nearly as present in the media. He's not nearly as often on screen in front of the camera. He's especially towards the end. He's not nearly as ubiquitous or always around at media events and cultural, events that are happening, involving Doctor Who, and he's there front and center saying, "Oh yes," and even when he's on the on screen talking about things, he's nowhere near as large of a personality as Moffat and RTD. He's nowhere near as jovial or large, speaking or exaggerating, hyperbolic, swinging arms and expressive hands as RTD is. RTD is a large, tall man. He has the physicality match. Although Chris Chibnall is actually, if you've seen him, is actually a fairly tall man himself. But the point is, even for being a taller man, he doesn't have that expressive personality as RTD does. He doesn't have the kind of the clever thinking, sly mind and using humor all the time as almost as a weapon or something, as Moffat does. He's kind of there and smiling and happy. He's whoever he is. But he's harder to say this is his personality because it's not a large or easily malleable, grippable personality. As a showrunner, that's also harder to understand because you mentioned when you started the recording that you want to go season by season, right? Well, each season of the Jodie Whittaker era, and therefore the vision perhaps even of each era, is very different from one another. And we can go into greater detail, but Series 11, if you were to take it as an isolation and expect that tone to continue, it's that's the word, isolated. It's isolated from most of the rest of Doctor Who. No in the main run before the new holiday special, you don't have returning monsters, you don't have any returning villains. It's all new. It's very stripped away, stripped down to maybe Doctor Who at its basics. It's a very classic era. But then the second series starts bringing back a lot of monsters and villains and characters like Captain Jack. So it almost seems to be recalling back to the events of. It seems to be more geared towards the new series and its history, especially RTD. And then the third series veers off into extremely radical territory because it is all about it connects more to the second series, but it's all about an event, an apocalyptic universe-destroying event that has its roots in an era that is totally off-screen and part of the lore changes that were introduced at the end of the second series. All the villains they are not the villains of that Swarm and Azure are not old enemies of Jodie Whittaker, but of Jo Martin and her Doctor. And so, taken as a whole, each section and therefore the vision that Chris Chibnall seems to have are very disparate. They don't connect terribly well at all. So to sum it, it's just in summation or just to summarize. He's very difficult to figure out because his personality is not large and big, and therefore you get a sense of the flavor of what's going on in his mind. But what he presents goes from being rather almost not boring, you could argue, but at least very simple stories to spikes of very different types of stories in the next year to then lore-changing explosions at that end, and then the aftermath of that explosion, literally, and just apocalyptic destruction dealing with the unseen events of this secret history of Doctor Who. It's very strange. It's almost, I'm not sure if it's really possible to get, even now, a few years later, to say Chris Chibnall is this type of showrunner because his ideas, as you say, their ambition, take very different forms. But you could certainly say, no matter what, that he is the guy that decided to make or at least in his time, the controversial decision to change the Doctor from a male to a female. So he is at the least, I would say you could summarize him as controversial, ambitious, and at least personally cordial.
Long, so we're gonna take a bit of a break here, and we'll catch you back in for part 2, where we talk about the actual seasons of the Whittaker era.
Exterminate!